I will now introduce Ross's Lesson 34, Introduction to First Noon Verbs. A first noon verb is a verb that has a noon in the first consonant of the root. Roots tend to be three consonants. And so if a root begins with a noon, we'll call that a first noon root. Now, noon has a tendency to assimilate. You might call the noon a chameleon. It tends to want to blend in with the background. It wants to be just like whoever it's next to. And that will cause it to assimilate. Now, we've already seen this with preposition mean. So if you take a word like melek, king, and add preposition mean to it, well, you could spell it with a makif and make them separate words, mean melek. But what will usually happen is that the noon will be pressed up against the mem. Then the noon will, chameleon type fashion, become just like the mem, become a mem. So you get, instead of mean melek, you get mimelek with two M's, and then why write it twice? We can write it once and just put a dot in it, and so you end up with the form mimelek. And this is a case where the noon has assimilated into the word that follows. We've also seen this with certain words like natan. When you add endings to natan, so for example, you want to make it a perfect and first common singular, natanti, I gave. Well, the form you would expect would be natan plus a t, natanti. But what will often happen is that the noon, being pressed up against the tav, wants to be just like the tav, and so it becomes a tav. And so instead of natanti, it becomes natati. And instead of writing two T's, you just write one T and let the dagesh serve both as a stop and as a doubling. And the form you'll actually see is natati. And that is the assimilated noon. And likewise, if you put a new ending at the end, so natan, to give, you want to say we gave, well, it should be in principle natan nu. But why write the noon twice when you can get away with writing it once and just putting a dagesh in? And so the form you'll actually see is natannu, with one noon with a dagesh for doubling. Well, those are all things that have been mentioned in earlier lessons along the way. But now we're going to see that something similar happens in first noon verbs in certain forms. So we'll start off with first noon verbs. The cal of first noon verbs show assimilation or loss of the initial noon in the imperfect, the imperative, and the infinitive. So if you take the verb nafal, which happens to mean to fall, you would expect the third masculine singular imperfect to be yin pol, with a noon in there, but then the noon is up against a pei, and being the chameleon that it is, it becomes a pei. And so instead of yin pol, you get yip pol, and then instead of writing it the pei twice, you write it once and put a dagesh in it. Same thing with nasa, which means to travel. Theoretically, the third masculine singular imperfect should be yin sa, but the noon will assimilate and become a samik, and you get yissa. And then why write it twice when you can write it once and just put a dagesh in there? And so yissa is the form. Now, if you were to look at this dagesh in the middle of that letter under a microscope, blow it up 1,000 times, you'll find that what is really there is a little teeny tiny noon that has assimilated. At least in my imagination, that's what I see there. So think of that dog H as actually a noon for these types of forms. And the same thing is true of nasa, which means to lift up. Yinsa becomes yissa, and instead of writing it twice, you write it once and put a dog H in it. Now, for the roots that have a sibilant in the middle consonant, there is going to be another complication. In places where you end up with a shava under the first consonant, the middle consonant of the root in the paradigm, then you're going to very likely lose your doubling. And so here you have for nasa is to travel, yinsa is he will travel, tisa is she or you will travel, but then you have you feminine singular is tis-e. And what's happened here is that you had the assimilated noon, a dog H, followed by a vocal shava. And what comes into play here is a rule that we call the Skeman-Levy rule. The Skeman-Levy rule is if you have a sibilant, a kof, a mem, a noon, a lamed, a vav, or a yod, again, samic, any kind of sibilant, a yod, mem, noon, lamed, vav, or yod, any of those doubled, followed by a vocal shava, very often you'll lose your doubling and you'll get a silent shava. And that is what happens here, that according to the paradigm pattern, it should have been like yin sa-e, but then it became yis-e, but then it just became, tis sa-e, but then it became tis-e. And the Skeman-Levy rule, doubling followed by vocal shava, ends up being losing your doubling and the shava becoming silent. The same thing with nasa. So it should have been a teen sa-e for the second feminine singular imperfect, but instead of doubling and followed by vocal shava, when you assimilate the noon, you lose your doubling and the shava becomes silent. You'll get that in the third common plural, no doubling. And so, again, it's going to be hard to figure these out because you're looking for that doubling to indicate an assimilated noon, but now it's gone, and you're just going to have to deduce that there must have been a noon there. Same thing in the second masculine plural. Both nasa and nasa, both forms lose their doubling, and the like. There's yet a further complication with natan, at least a couple of forms with natan, where you have a noon as the final consonant of the root. Not only will the noon assimilate into the second consonant of the root, the second noon will assimilate to the na ending for the third feminine plural imperfects and the second feminine plural imperfects, which happen to be the same form. And so instead of getting teen, tain, na, with a noon and a noon before and after the tav, you assimilate the first noon, titain, and you write the second noon just once. You do pronounce it, but you just write it once and let the dog H in the na ending serve as an indication that the noon was there. So you get a titaina is the form that you'll actually see. Well, let me move on to the Cal imperative. First noon verbs that have a theme vowel holum in the Cal imperfect have regular imperatival forms. So if you take nafal, make it imperfect, it becomes yipol, but you can get nafol as your imperatival form, which is exactly what you would expect from the strong verb. However, first noon verbs that have a theme vowel pata in the cal imperfect have a shortened irregular imperative. The initial noon of the root will disappear in such forms. Take, for example, the verb nagash, to approach. The imperfect, he will approach, is yigash, where the noon has assimilated. Originally it should have been a yingash. It would be better for us to take actually the second masculine singular imperfect, and that would be tigash with a tav. But then one way you can get from imperfect forms to imperative forms is to drop the T. And so if you take second masculine singular imperative tigash, drop the T, you get gosh. Or tigashi would be gashi if you drop the T. And all these forms would be the parallel with the second person imperfects in the masculine singular, masculine plural, feminine plural, and dropping the T's. And once you do that, you get the imperatival form. And where there would have been a doubling, the doubling goes away. So with yisa, it isn't sa with two S's somehow, but just one S and no doubling. The doubling disappears. Move on to the cal infinitive constructs. First noon verbs that have theme vowel pata in the cal imperfect also have irregular infinitive constructs. So if you take the verbs nagash and nasa and nasa and natan, make them imperfect, they will assimilate, make them imperative. We've shown those forms already. But in the infinitive construct, what's going to happen is that they're going to behave almost like a sigilet noun in some cases. So with gosh, it becomes geshet. You add a T and then treat what's left as if it were a sigilet. Geshet. Same thing with nasa. You add a T, treat what's left as a sigilet, and because you have the I-Nun, which is a guttural, gutturals like A rather than E, unless you're an Aleph, and so it ends up being a sigilet pattern with a pata rather than a sagol. And so you get sa'at as your form. With nasa, you actually get three different forms of the infinitive construct, one completely regular, naso, but one in which you compensate for losing the noon in the front by adding a T, and originally you would have had sagol, and two short sagols add up to one long sagol, and you get two shorties add up to one longie, and you get a sate. And then sometimes it'll move and you get a sa'ate. Anyway, three different forms. And then with natan, well, you add a T to compensate for losing the noon at the beginning, and you should have had something like a tenet, but the noon assimilates, probably because there was a consonantal cluster at one time before you made it into a sigilet pattern. And so since it assimilates, it disappears, and all you get is a tet. And that means to give, tate. And that's a real difficult form to parse because you've lost two consonants of your root. You've lost a noon at the front and you've lost a noon at the back. And you'll just have to learn to see this very common form.